We all use chemicals every day, in our homes and in our workplaces. They are part of our lives. If used properly, they are safe and effective. But if we don't know the hazards, serious accidents can occur. Industry relies on the powerful properties of chemicals to clean, dissolve, stabilize, and weld. However, if not handled properly, hazardous materials can cause damaging or deadly side effects. Whmis stands for Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System. Whmis was developed jointly by government, industry, and labor to protect workers who handle hazardous materials. There are three main parts to Whmis: labels, material safety data sheets, and worker education. Its purpose is to put information about hazardous materials into the hands of the workers. The supplier label and the symbol on it are part of the Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, or Whmis. Under Whmis legislation, your employers are required to identify all workplace hazardous materials and make sure that they are properly identified. Your employer must also instruct and train workers who are likely to be exposed to hazardous materials. Additional information for each hazardous chemical must be made available in the form of a Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, which comes with the product. This data sheet will tell you how this chemical can hurt you if used improperly, how to safely handle and store it, and what to do in an emergency situation. MSDS gives you detailed information about the material and how to handle it safely. Workers have a responsibility to use this information to protect themselves from the harmful effects of hazardous materials. Jonathan Skidmore was on the job only 3 days. The work seemed simple enough. Pour the chemical xylene from a large container into a smaller one. The supplier label identified this chemical as flammable and combustible. Jonathan knew that flammable and combustible means more than simply not smoking in the area. You also have to make sure there is no equipment nearby creating sparks, flames, or heat, or take precautions to prevent the buildup of static electricity. Without warning, the chemical burst into flames. The fire burned 80% of Jonathan's body. How could this senseless tragedy have been prevented? Jonathan's employer should have told him that certain liquids may cause static electricity to build up while they're being poured. The fire that burned Jonathan was started by static electricity. To prevent static electricity from building up, you must ground the large container to a ground in the building. Then, you must bond the larger container you are pouring from to the smaller container you are pouring into. Jonathan did not know this. He died 3 days later in hospital. Flammable and combustible materials can be ignited in many different ways. Do you know what they are? Jobs that create sparks or heat, such as grinding, cutting and welding, unprotected electric plugs, unprotected lighting, or an overhead heater. Vapors can travel a long distance to an ignition source, causing a disaster. Do you have any of these ignition sources in your workplace? If you work with materials that have this symbol, the material is flammable or combustible, and you should avoid ignition sources. On July 21, 1994, Ed Pollock, a maintenance worker at a packaging facility, found a leaking drum. The drum contained hazardous materials. It should have been labeled, but the label had been torn off. Now, put yourself in Ed's position. What would you do in this situation? A. Clean up the spill immediately to prevent the chemical from spreading. B. Try to identify the chemical by smelling it or touching it. C. Call your supervisor. If you chose A, this is exactly what Ed did. Ed began to clean up the spill. But something wasn't right. Had a fellow worker not found him within a short period of time, Ed would have died from the serious health effects of the chemical. If you had chosen B, to try and identify the chemical by smelling it or touching it, it could be unsafe. For instance, if the chemical happened to be corrosive, Ed could have been badly burned. For those of you who chose C, to call your supervisor, you are correct. The drum had no label on it, therefore the chemical could not be identified. If Ed had seen this symbol, he would have known the material inside was a serious toxic substance. Chemicals with the skull and crossbones symbol may cause immediate and serious health effects, such as loss of consciousness, coma, or death within minutes or hours of exposure. The supplier label would have told him what the material is, the name of the supplier, to refer to the material safety data sheet, the hazard symbol, the effects of harmful exposure, how to handle the material safely, first aid measures. The supplier label always has a distinctive border, and it is presented in English and French. Every supplier is required by law to label all hazardous materials with this information. Your employer is also required to ensure that the label stays on the container, or replace it right away with a workplace label if it becomes torn or unreadable. If you find a container without a label, don't handle it. Contact your supervisor. You have a right to refuse to handle material if you don't know what it is. If you see this symbol on a container in your workplace, handle it with extreme caution. It is a poisonous substance that may cause serious health effects. On January 10, 1997, Michelle Moore went to work as usual. Her job that day was to clean metal panels in preparation for painting. At her workstation, Michelle prepared to pour nitric acid from a large storage drum into a smaller container. She was careful to apply a workplace label on the container as she had been trained to do. The symbol on the label identified the contents as corrosive material. Michelle was wearing her personal protective equipment, with the exception of her face shield. Michelle was able to get to an eye wash station quickly. Luckily, she took the correct first aid measures and only suffered minor burns. Had Michelle worn the proper personal protective equipment, she would not have been injured at all. Michelle learned the hard way. When you're handling a corrosive material, you can't afford to skip any safety steps. If you work with hazardous materials, make sure you read the labels. Talk to your supervisor about it. And if you need more information, read the MSDS. Know the first aid measures for each hazardous material you handle. Don't assume that what applies to one chemical would apply to another. When handling corrosives which have this symbol, wear all the required protective gear at all times. Keep in mind that many corrosives are strong enough to eat through metal. Think of what they can do to you. On October 12, 1994, Chris was loading a supply of compressed gas cylinders for a welding project. Taking off, the cylinder hit the guardrail and barely missed him. However, a co-worker driving a lift truck was not as fortunate. The cylinder knocked him off his lift truck and onto a pile of metal parts where he lay seriously injured. How could this accident have been prevented? Had Chris used safe transporting procedures, this incident would not have happened. It's important to use valve covers and have them securely in place. And it is equally important to secure the tanks with a chain or similar device while storing or transporting them. Cylinders containing compressed gas must be identified by this Whmis symbol. Liquefied by pressure, this substance may also be highly reactive to heat, flame, or other chemicals. Some compressed gases are also toxic, corrosive, or can cause frostbite if released. That's why you may see these other symbols on the label as well. Compressed gas cylinders must be stored securely in a cool, dry place. Before handling it, be sure to read about the specific product. When you see this symbol on a container, it means that the contents is under pressure. Your employer is responsible for training you in the proper use of this potentially dangerous material. It's your responsibility to use this information. You may see a Whmis label with this symbol in your workplace. It means that the material inside is an oxidizer. Oxidizers cause other materials to catch fire by supplying the oxygen they need to burn. Take acetylene, for example. Acetylene does not burn very well, but when oxygen is added, enough heat is generated to burn metal. If you work with combustible materials and oxidizers, arm yourself with knowledge. When you see a supplier or workplace label, read it. If you come across a hazardous material that is missing a label, don't work with it until you know what's in the container. If you need more information, read the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, which comes with the product. This data sheet has more technical information. Watch out for oxidizers. Keep them away from flammable and combustible materials. For many years, Ken Belby worked for an auto parts rebuilding company. His job was to repair parts that could be recycled for final assembly. Degreaser solvent was used to remove grease and dirt from the parts. How could a knowledge of Whmis help him to protect his health and safety on the job? A, Ken would have notified his supervisor that the supplier label was not readable. B, the MSDS would have told him how the material could enter his body and affect his health. C, Ken would have learned the proper handling procedures, including the correct personal protective equipment to use. If you picked A, you are correct. Ken would have told his supervisor that the supplier label was not readable. A workplace label would have been applied to replace the damaged supplier label. The workplace label has 3 essential elements. These are the name of the hazardous material, how to work with it safely, reference to the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS. If you picked B, you're also correct. If Ken had known about Whmis and checked the MSDS for the solvent he was using, he would have known that this class of chemical may cause long-term health effects. If you picked C, right again. Ken would have known how to work with the chemical safely. Let's go back. Ken worked with the chemical for years without proper safety equipment. He had no knowledge of the harmful effects of the material. Gradually, a serious problem did occur. Ken developed dermatitis, a painful skin disease that forced him to seek treatment. Ken didn't know it, but over time, the toxic chemical had entered his body in 3 ways. Through breathing, as he inhaled vapors. Through swallowing, while eating lunch. Ken's hands were often covered in the chemical, which he transferred to his food. The material also passed through Ken's skin while he worked and entered his bloodstream. Although Ken became ill, his doctor told him he was lucky. The toxic chemical could have affected his kidneys, liver, or other internal organs. When you see this symbol, it means that the material is toxic, and you will need to know how to protect yourself. In this video, we've covered 6 hazard symbols. There are 2 other hazard symbols that we will briefly describe now. One of them represents biohazardous infectious material. It is usually found in medical and healthcare facilities. Biohazardous material may cause serious infectious disease. Therefore, you must be properly trained to use this material and always wear the proper personal protective equipment. The last classification is dangerously reactive material. This substance may react with water to produce a poisonous gas. It may explode from shock, friction, or heat, or it may explode in a heated container. Only highly trained personnel are permitted to handle dangerously reactive material. It's time to review what we've learned about Whmis. Let's see how Whmis works with a new employee. Part of Tanya's new job will involve handling hazardous materials. Her supervisor is about to give her Whmis training. Good training will mean that Tanya will learn how to read and interpret Whmis supplier labels and workplace labels. This will include information about the 8 hazard symbols. Next, she will learn about material safety data sheets, what information they contain, and where they are located. She will be taught how to handle the hazardous material she'll be working with, and all the procedures and processes she'll need to know to protect herself and others from accidents and illness. It's Tanya's right as an employee to be taught about Whmis, how to handle hazardous materials safely, and what to do in an emergency before she starts work. It's her responsibility to apply what she's learned. Once on the job, if Tanya is still unsure about the correct procedure, she shouldn't feel embarrassed to go back to her supervisor and ask for clarification, because she knows that when it comes to Whmis, you should make safety your first priority.